8 months ago, I had a discussion about Path of Exile 2 with Jonathan on a podcast, and I asked him this.
I'd like to pick your brain a little bit about a pretty contentious topic in the PoE community right now, which is Magic Find. In terms of what I dislike about the idea, it would be, for example, that it's a weird sort of concoction where you remove power from your character in order to get more items, which kind of feels a little bit antithetical to the whole ARPG power fantasy. And at the same time, you also have this weird dynamic where your builds kind of become just these farming machines for like currency per hour, where you say, I'm going to sacrifice this gear slot, this gear slot, this gear slot, or this suffix.
For reference, at the time that this aired, we just had one of the worst examples of Magic Find ever in Path of Exile 1, which was Affliction League. An absolute, I would say, disaster from a build making perspective, because if you weren't able to squeeze every inch of quantity on your build, you basically were screwed. And while the league overall was incredibly fun because of how fun the mechanic was and how easily accessible it was, slaying a lot of monsters, it did put a little bit of an emphasis on the Magic Find issue. Now, at the time, I got quite a bit of pushback, especially from the Path of Exile 2 Reddit, about occupying this Path of Exile 2 podcast for Path of Exile 1 means, but I really just meant it as an example. At the time, I was already completely honed in to what Path of Exile 2 is going to bring us, and I didn't want Path of Exile 2 to pan out the same way Path of Exile 1 did. And turns out it actually got worse. And lo and behold, 1 month after this discussion where we had quite a big of a back and forth, a lot of people said I was rude, I was a little bit too like confrontational, which I could definitely see. After that, something actually changed. They completely removed item quantity. And of course, that wasn't just because I talked to Jonathan directly and I gave him the problem a little bit more upfront. It was because a lot of people at the time were complaining about that issue, about the quantity issue. And guess what? Ever since then, Rarity is removed. There's no more issues with anything itemization-wise. People who are rich can actually wear good gear instead of having to dilute their stuff with Rarity. It's only upside. But before we go into all of that, I want to quickly talk about the term economy and like ruining an economy, because this is what most people say when they say Magic Find bad, item rarity bad. And while I can understand where they're coming from, an economy is usually just a mirror of what's happening in the game, which means that usually when you have the feeling that an economy is ruined, which is already very subjective, it's usually because something else in the game is going on. For example, an abuse or bad faith actors doing something that might be ban-worthy. And in this case, you have something that GGG gives to you that will warp the economy. Now, we're gonna talk about a lot of the ifs and buts and people saying Magic Find is fine because, and I'm even gonna give you some good examples of pushback that people give that Rarity could be fine. But I just want to line this out that this video will not be about the economy and how it ruins it. That is, like I said, very subjective and hard to measure. You could say we're going to measure it like in real life where we say the difference between people who don't have a lot of currency and have a lot of currency is not as wide. But then you could argue, well, then the very easy to get items are going to be better as well because of trickle down or whatever you want to say. We could have this discussion forever and it needs a lot of analysis. And at this point, with this game being so young, it's literally impossible, in my opinion, to determine whether the economy gets ruined at any point. What we can talk about is distributing items, though, because how a game gives you the loot that you want is very important to how you're going to enjoy it. And a lot of people, when I push back against Rarity, which, by the way, just in case you know, back when I first made that video, it wasn't as popular of an opinion as it is right now. That's why I'm speaking a little bit defensively here. Is how the game gives you the items, right? So, for example, if we look right here, this is one of the distribution methods. They say if you take this node right here, you get 3% rarity. So, let's say you take away all rarity from gear, and let's say that would amount to 297% rarity. If they made this node here from 3% to 300%, the game would look exactly the same. Just exactly the same, 1-to-1. So, I'm not saying I want people to have less loot. I'm saying that the way you acquire that stat should not be on items. And I will give some more examples to that once we get into number 3. But let's first talk about difficulty. This is probably the most obvious one to distribute currency is, well, we made the twisted domain more difficult. We'll give you more loot for it. You got through this encounter, so now you're getting a passive point. So that feeds into stuff like progression. You get more and more progression points, so now you're going to get more and more loot. Then we have what you could call efficiency. Somebody who's better at reading layouts or faster on their character or just doesn't waste as much time will make more currency per hour because they are being efficient. They're using their time better. And you can influence this with stuff like AoE, movement speed, even projectile speed in some scenarios, damage, whatever. Those could all be called as giving you more loot, right? It's not as obvious as with Rarity because it also makes your character stronger, which should be like the first thing you think about when you think about itemization. But that's how it is. All of these kind of determine how much currency you make per hour. And then we have something that is called clever use of game mechanics. So this is always like very close to what is like an exploit and what is actually something that is just you being clever about the game and you figuring out something. Something that is an example of this in PoE 1 is there are beasts in the game, which are basically itemized crafting thingies that you can get from catching Pokemons in map, right? So you kill one of those thingies in the map. It's like these red things on the minimap. And once you catch them, you get a crafting option. Okay, so then you find out that there are certain level restrictions where they, I don't know, only start spawning at level 74, or this one starts spawning at level 77. So you figure out that the one you want is at level 72. So by running lower tier maps, you can actually exclude a lot of the bad beasts and farm more of the beasts that you want. That's you being smart, right? That's you figuring out something and bringing that to the table and getting more currency than other people's that don't do that, which you could equate to Rarity, but we'll get to that. So all of these are determined to how much items GGG wants to give you. If GGG wanted to give you more items, they could make this 3 into a 30. They could make it into 300, whatever. What I'm trying to say with this is also there's no number that you should be getting, which is also why I don't really like to talk about a ruined economy. Is like, what is GGG's goal? I don't know. So yeah. Now, starting itemization issues, I just want to point out once again, I don't think there's any issue of giving people progression points that give them rarity. Like if they clear hard content, they should be rewarded for that. That should be the core of how you acquire items actually. The faster you are, the stronger your character is, the more time you invest to min-max your character, the more you should be rewarded. However, the whole system kind of falls apart when you add increased item rarity. So let's look at the itemization issues. Having mandatory stats sucks. And I will explain this with the most innocent example I can think of, which is movement speed on boots. In Path of Exile 1, there are actually a few examples where your whirling blades or your leap slam, which doesn't scale with movement speed, and you can still move around like crazy. So movement speed isn't necessarily mandatory, but it's definitely something that you would want on most characters. Now, Path of Exile 2 is different. Movement speed is like everything. Some bosses, you can straight up walk out of all of their attacks if you have enough movement speed, and it's like you play a different game. So should movement speed be something that's just on boots implicitly? Well, yeah, probably, because it is a mandatory slot. If something is a mandatory slot on an item, well, all you're doing now by putting it as one of the stats is if you don't have that stat, now your item is worthless. So where's the point in customization? So if we put that into an easy perspective, an item consists of 3 prefixes and 3 suffixes. Let's just leave the implicit out for simplicity's sake. All you're really doing is tell people, well, no, actually you have 2 prefixes left and you need this movement speed. And sure, you can maybe say, oh, I'm going to get away with 30 move speed, but if you don't have move speed here, what the hell are you doing? What are your boots supposed to be? There's no like, oh, maybe this build needs that, this build needs this. No, if you don't have movement speed, worthless. So that is, in my opinion, bad game design. It is an illusion of choice. So how can we kind of compare that to Rarity? Well, let's take just, for example, the ring slot here. Same thing, 3 prefixes, 3 suffixes. Now here we have Rarity and Rarity, 1 time in the prefix, 1 time in the suffix. I want to make this clear again. It doesn't matter if Rarity falls off at a certain amount. If there is a way to get more loot in the game, people will want to acquire that stat. But what you basically did now is you removed a prefix and you removed a suffix. Okay, let's zoom out. Let's say everybody knows this, which they don't. So you're already creating a huge difference between people who don't know and people who do know for, I think, not really any reason. It's a very like subtle thing. But okay, so you now basically just remove the prefix and remove the suffix. Because now what's going to happen is everybody is going to get this and this. And all we did is simplify the game and take away your options. Now, the counter argument to this could be, well, but Rarity doesn't work on everything. To that, I would say, okay, but historically in Path of Exile, mapping, which is the thing that does work for Rarity, has been at the center stage. And do you really want to make a build economy where every build that can't include enough rarity has to do side content. I'm not sure that's a good choice. And if you extrapolate that to 2 rings, helmet, amulet, gloves, and boots, you can kind of see where there's a little bit of a problem here. You are now removing countless of options from your gear in general. Now, that is just the first problem though. The second issue is rares versus uniques. Now, I will once again refer back to Power Exile 1 with this issue. In Power Exile 1, quantity was not on rare items, it was on uniques, and really bad ones at that. They basically knew that you will have to sacrifice your whole boot slot or your whole glove slot if you wanted some quantity. Goldworms used to give up to 20% quantity of items found, which is a ridiculous stat, and it was possible because the hardest content in the game was easy enough that a good amount of players was able to do that content while basically sacrificing your gear slots completely. That was because they mirrored a weapon, they had ridiculous gear otherwise, or they played an overpowered build. What this meant was you have these absolutely decked out builds with total dog shit, multiple chaos items on top just because they can. And if they could, they would like to actually wear gear, but that would be worse because they would just make less currency per hour for no real sacrifice. And sure, technically there is sacrifice. If your character is not up to par, then you cannot wear these items and you will have to wear boots with life, boots with resistances to cap your resistances, spell suppression or whatever. More movement speed, sure, but the issue is the further you got, the more you could multiply that advantage and just snowball into oblivion. Now, what they thought in Path of Exile 2 is they are going to make it better because it's not going to be on uniques anymore. It's just going to be a roll on rares, right? Like, what could go wrong? So for example, this shitty amulet here, I have a rarity roll right there. I could also get an implicit if I wanted to have a gold amulet. I could have a suffix. I could have like 70 rarity if I wanted to. Same on rings, right? Okay, so you can still have, I don't know, attributes and rarity and maybe a life roll or something. Is that better? Well, the answer is no, because now you have a new issue, which is unique items. Now every unique item that doesn't have rarity on it, which is most unique items, have a huge downside. So do you balance uniques now around the fact that you're going to lose that rarity? Do you give every unique rarity to compensate for that? Or do you just like, I don't know, like how are you supposed to, for example, I will just give you an example. How are you supposed to make a mapper that revolves around Call of the Brotherhood? Like you're losing out on this amount of rarity, maybe even a gold ring implicit. And then you, on top of that, you have ingenuity, which scales off of that rarity. You're losing like 100 rarity. Your build is at a massive disadvantage for just trying to fit Call of the Brotherhood into the build. And this is now true for every other slot. Gloves, helmet, amulet, boots, and even belt. Ingenuity is incredibly strong, don't get me wrong. But the rarity meta doesn't exactly help the fact that this is the GG belt. So in fact, I would claim that the old meta, where at least you had to sacrifice your whole item, was a better payoff than the new meta, which is basically just, oh, you just get it on rares and everybody just uses rares. And all these uniques that might be built around, if they're in the wrong slot, you're already working from such a disadvantage. Now, let's talk about one point that I hear a lot, which basically says rarity is optional though, pal. You don't have to drop more items in maps. And to that, I would say, yes, you can also put a clown nose on, make the sound like honk honk, right? And just move on with your day. Yes, you can. But most people, even if they don't 100% care, they kind of care about the fact that they are now making an objectively wrong decision. And while the fact that games are just games, it's just Pixel Bros is fine and all, but if you're watching this video, chances are you care a lot more than most people already, so that's a little bit of a weird thing to say. But at the end of the day, it doesn't change anything with the problem. Even if it's just something that is only perception in your mind, it's only perception because rarity falls off at 230, 300%, whatever that is still a problem of perception. And I guess the last topic here is it falls off at X%, so it's fine. We've had a lot of these recently where people are doing X rares, X maps with this much rarity, this much rarity, this much rarity. And my point for that will flow very casually into the next point, why I think that just doesn't really matter. Now, one thing that Jonathan said in this interview that I kind of want to counter is what he said right here.
If we don't have Magic Find, there's really only 2 things you can scale up your character, the defenses and the damage. And having that third axis is really the main reason we want to do that, because there's not very many axes it can be on your character. So that is the argument.
Now, obviously, I put Jonathan on the spot here. I did tell him beforehand that I would ask about it, but having a good retort to what I asked there is kind of hard in the moment, especially if you're not as involved as, for example, Mark is in terms of like balancing and itemization and whatnot. But I quickly want to counter this point just in terms of this video. Axes of a build are not just damage, defense, and then you add rarity. There's a lot more. There's, for example, stuff like AoE, which will let you clear faster, have you like basically cover more enemies. There is recovery, which is, okay, you lose life, your defense kicks in, but now you need to recover that back, or with energy shield, right? Whatever that is. Cost sustain. So for example, if you have mana or you have life tab, you will have to recover life again, sustain. And then there's also something a little bit more ambiguous like feel, right? Where you could say stuff like totem placement speed comes in, projectile speed. Those things do make your build feel better and feel stronger, even though maybe they don't show up in your stats. And then you could overlap stuff from damage like attack and cast speed directly into that feel, because as you know, the more attack speed you have, the more responsive your character feels. And I want to point this out because I don't think rarity is necessary in any of these slots. There is so many things you could put on items that are more interesting and less problematic. All right, so let's talk about the problems moving forward. I want you to understand that the problem of rarity will never be as light as it is right now. With every single new league, there will be new avenues where you can exploit the stat. It can be good in some leagues, worse in some other leagues, and just like create whole problems on its own. I want to start off with a grotesque item that you've never seen before if you haven't played PoE 1. This is one of the stupidest items I've ever seen in any RPG that has been like ever created. Item quantity support. And don't get like fooled by the low number. This amount of quantity in PoE 1 is ridiculous. It's not like rarity in PoE 2. It is like unheard of. And you would get up to 36 plus with quantity, even more, on whatever skill you kill an enemy with. So you put this on your main damage dealer and you get more quantity. It's going to be very hard for you to figure out what happened in this meta. It's basically everybody was running on a 5 link with this as a 6 link. That is literally what happened. Probably the most stupid item they've ever made. What I'm trying to say here is that is just a small thing of what could be coming in new leagues. And it stifles design space quite a bit. So for example, they want to introduce something that in any shape or form affects gear. Now they have to think about rarity every single time and have to balance around it. But let's talk about those problems moving forward. There will be league mechanics coming out every so often. They said every 3 to 4 months. And if you don't know, those are basically expansions, mini expansions or bigger expansions, whatever you want to call it, that are free and that are going to get added to the game. And it's going to, I don't know, for example, oh, there's these beasts running around in the map. Oh, or there's this monolith that if you click on it, monsters pop out, right? All of those things. For example, Breach would be one of those mechanics that they ported over from Path of Exile 1, and each of them will affect rarity differently. And there have been a plethora of problematic leaks over the years. I will just name a few that are a little bit more recent. For example, Scourge League, Sentinel League, and probably the biggest offender was Affliction. Now, since I don't know if rarity is ever going to be addressed in early access, I'm not really expecting it to be. Once new leagues drop, I just want you to listen for certain catchphrases that people will say to excuse this. The first one is, oh, well, Sentinel, it's not really Magic Find that's the issue. It's just that Sentinel has these multipliers, you understand? Like if those multipliers weren't in there, okay, so it's not Magic Find. Magic Find is not the issue. Scourge, well, Scourge is just spewing too many mobs out, and that plus beyond is just, it's not Magic Find, that's the problem. It's just like, you know, the Scourge mechanic itself. But at some point, don't you have to think that there's a common denominator that is the problem? Like there is your buddy Frank. Whenever he's in your friend group, everything goes sour. Everybody's pissed. People are fighting. And weirdly enough, whenever he's not there, everybody's chill, calm. Well, guess what? Frank fucking sucks. If GGG has to constantly think about this one thing that they could add anywhere else other than itemization, in order to just make the game more healthy, increase their design space, why is it even here? And that is exactly what happened 5 or 6 months ago, where item quantity has been removed from the game. And guess what happened? Nothing happened. The game is way healthier. Everybody actually has good gear on. People who usually have, I don't know, hundreds of divines, mirrors, now actually have gear that reflects that. And yeah, that's what happened. And I've spoken to people behind the scenes who loved Rarity, who were always just stacking Rarity on League Start, and they're now kind of happy that they can now wear good gear, because now they have more stuff to spend on with the currency instead of using shitty Rarity gear. So in general, like, it's just a net positive, and GG doesn't have to think about, oh, if I put this multiplier too high, like Rarity is going, or quantity or whatever, is going to shoot into oblivion. And obviously, I have to say it again, in the future, there will be new uniques and therefore archetypes introduced that might get judged solely on the amount of magic fight that they can get if they're mapping, which is their big mapping system, which scales very well with quantity. Well, if there's a new unique ring that is your build around, then you're gonna start at minus 100 Rarity. Sure, now you could argue again, well, how good is Rarity over 100%, blah, blah, blah. That's all good. But in general, this problem just remains, and once again, the question is, why though? Now, let's talk about number 5. Let's play devil's advocate for a second, and let's talk about just capping Rarity. Let's say we cap Rarity at 100%. So what would happen? So you could argue, which is actually a good argument, that resistances kind of are already that, right? And movement speed, which we talked about. Because you have to get resistance, unless you suck at the game and you have 68%, which I just now realized. Holy moly. But in general, you have to be res cap. Why does it have to be on items? Once again, we can play this infinitely. If you're like, oh, there's not enough special stats on an item, there's a lot of stats that you cannot get on items that would be interesting, like AoE, projectile speed, weapon swap speed, totem placement speed, right? Maybe something that's a little bit more niche. Maybe make it more about getting percentage increased elemental damage. For a spellcaster, there's very, very little in the prefixes if they don't care about mana, for example. Why something that could also just be connected to the normal progression curve where it makes absolutely no problem? There's no issue with Rarity there. It's just basically build gets stronger, you progress more, you get more loot. Why? But this is still the best point for Rarity. Another issue that this would have, though, if you just cap it at 100 and you say it's basically mandatory, is you would have to make it very clear to new players that they're getting scuffed. So is there a reason to introduce a stat that if you don't have it, you drop like half loot or whatever, right? Like, I'm just making an example. Is that worth it? It's like kind of a noob thing where people are not going to have 100% Rarity, so they're scuffed. So now everybody else is snowballing and they can't afford anything. Is there a reason for that? And I think the answer is, once again, just no. But I think that if you wanted to have Rarity in your game for whatever reason, which I will never understand, then this would be, I think, the way to go. Now, after yapping for a long time, I will round this topic out with probably my worst thought out point that I don't really know how to get across. It's just something that I think is more anecdotal. Maybe some people can kind of connect with that. But that is the idea of power fantasy. If you take Path of Exile seriously, and it's like your main game or even your secondary game, spreadsheets are a norm. Knowing simple math is a norm. Knowing how damage scales is a norm. All these things are stuff that you can sink your time into and learn, and they will give you an advantage. However, with Rarity, that kind of intertwines with this idea of your builds only being farming machines. Hidden within this massive web of passive points, there is still kind of the idea that the strength of your character matters, and the stronger you get it, the bigger things you will achieve. And Rarity is kind of completely antithetical to that. It kind of removes this illusion of harder content equals more currency and introduces a new layer that kind of gets you out of it. And I don't know how to explain this. This might be completely anecdotal, but I kind of compare it to, for example, wrestling. If I watch wrestling, I know that it's fake. Nobody needs to tell me that, but I'm just here for the entertainment, right? It's kind of fun. But like, imagine watching that and every 5 seconds there's like a blip where it says like, this is fake. This is fake. This is kind of how I feel about Rarity, where while itemizing my character, I kind of realize that in reality, if you get it all down to like to the atom, it's all about currency per hour, which is obviously not true, right? It's about so many more things, right? Like creativity, fun, all those things. But I just cannot help but have that in the back of my mind all the time. If it's just in my progression curve, it feels completely natural. But once again, this is probably my worst point and very anecdotal, so don't take it too seriously. But this is how I feel personally. So what's my conclusion here? In general, I cannot find a different conclusion than Rarity needs to get removed from items completely. I think you can, if you feel like the game doesn't spew out enough currency or enough items without it, you can always add this. You can, for example, make a main tree here where you say increased amount of items dropped, increased amount of currency dropped, increased amount of waystones dropped. All of these things can be introduced in so many kinds of ways, but putting it on items just is, in my opinion, a no-go. And if you removed it, you would open up design space, especially for coming uniques. It also future-proofs the game. Sure, you can now say, oh, it falls off at 120%, 150, whatever. But is that true in like a year? Is that true when this league mechanic hits the fan, right? Like this comes out, this comes out. It will just make it extremely hard for GGG to balance this constantly. And whenever they make a mistake, that mistake will snowball into crazy levels. And even if they find the perfect balance every single league, is it worth their headspace? Is it worth their time? And also, spoiler alert, it won't happen. It didn't happen in PoE 1. That's where it got removed. And we're now in a healthy state. Let's see what happens to it in PoE 2. And it also removes FOMO. On FOMO, I want to say that a lot of people say, well, it's not actually that. It's not actually, you're not actually missing out. And those could all be valid points. It's like, oh, you're not missing out. You have 100 rarity. You're at a good spot. The other guy has 300 rarity, but he's only getting a little bit more. Those do matter, of course. The breakpoints do matter. But perceived FOMO is still FOMO. And whether somebody's having fun or perceived fun is kind of the same thing. It's kind of like having your artsy, perfectly well-made film that nobody wants to watch because it's not entertaining, and it's like, well, people should like this because I did it by the book and it's really good. It's like, no, people perceive it a certain way. And the same is true for stuff like, how do people perceive rarity? Do they actually miss out, or they only feel like it? Well, it doesn't matter as much as you think at the end of the day, because it might still decide whether they have fun in the game or don't have fun in the game. And this is a little bit of a contentious topic, I understand, because you could also say, oh, just educate people better. People need to be better educated. But then you could go back to, well, it's just a game for most people. They only play 2 hours a day. They don't want to read into all that. So at the end of the day, this is kind of my stance on item rarity. I think it needs to go. This video is way too long. See ya.